You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Hey, Profiles and Liberty listeners. It's Caleb Franz here, your humble host, and I have been absent for a little bit. That is because I have been working on a book project that you may have heard about called The Conductor. It is a biography on the life of the abolitionist John Rankin, and I gave a talk in Indianapolis that went into a lot of the Q&A and a lot of the discussions around his life. This is a story that I became really passionate about over the past few years, and it's one that I think that you'll really enjoy. So please give it a listen, and be sure to keep an eye out for the book.
And really, throughout most of his life, he never lived in any large metropolitan area like New York City or Washington, D.C., or Boston. He primarily lived on the front lines of the fights against slavery. Ripley, Ohio is a town right on the Ohio River. He would often send fugitives up the Ripley line that would intersect with if you're all familiar with Levi Coffin, Indiana conductor on the Underground Railroad as well. He would send them up, and he sent over 2,000 fugitive slaves up the Ripley line into Canada, and he never once lost a passenger. That is one of the most, if not the most, some of the specifics of the Underground Railroad by nature are a bit secretive. So we may never know the exact number, but it was one of, if not the most active stations that took place on the Underground Railroad. He was also, in this book, I kind of highlight him as the father of abolitionism. All that means isn't necessarily that he is the first to ever be against slavery or the first to ever come up with the idea that there should be a political process or a movement against slavery. But what he did was he was very vocal and put together the argument of immediate emancipation for everyone to read and to understand through his letters on American slavery. And those letters became, I compare them to the Federalist Papers for the abolitionist movement. These took the country by storm, and especially in the Ohio River Valley, and they even influenced a very young William Lloyd Garrison before he was fully bought into the idea of immediate emancipation, and it sort of tipped him over the edge. So that's kind of the overview. There's several individuals that we can speak about. Had a profound influence on the Beechers, Harry Beecher Stowe, Lyman Beecher, Henry Ward Beecher. Ulysses S. Grant as well was his student in Ripley College right before he went to West Point. So this figure, the reason why I wanted to, I'll close with this before we get into the discussion. The reason why I wanted to write this figure is because he isn't very well known. And if I asked most of you before coming to this event, and maybe even now, if you know anything about Reverend John Rankin, the likelihood is that most of you probably wouldn't, and certainly most people out in the world would not. And that is a real shame, I think, because it really showcases how so many of the monumental events throughout American history takes place not in the places that we all think of, not always in the halls of Congress, not always on the streets of New York City, but oftentimes it's in small communities across the country where good people are standing up to do the thing that's right, regardless of what consequences that may bestow upon them, including tremendous risk to the safety, to the health and safety of not only Reverend Rankin, but his family and those in the community around him. That's a tremendous story of courage that I think that everyone today really could find a lot of value out of.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Caleb, I have to ask, Reverend Rankin, clearly very skilled at activism, at organizing, and I think so many on the center right, especially, looking past the monumental, the most important election of our time, right? Like we just passed that election. What do you think are some of the qualities of Reverend Rankin that we as people in 2024 as 2025 can kind of emulate in our own communities to bring about change?
Well, I think the first quality is that he was so community focused. The vast majority of this story takes place in Ripley, Ohio, and it doesn't go too far outside of that, with the exception of a couple of conventions here or there, or like his journey to Ripley. But the vast majority of the book does take place in Ripley because that community aspect is what made his operation so successful on the Underground Railroad. There are a few really great stories that come to mind. One in particular is when he is away and there are bounty hunters that come to his door, and his wife and kids are at his house by themselves. And they have this standoff where his wife sticks a shotgun in the face of the bounty hunters, and you have the community members in Ripley kind of realizing what's going on and rushing up the hill to run to their aid and run to their defense. And I think that really illustrates how well he's been able to develop this sense of trust, because when you're working on an operation like this, so much of it is so secretive that it really relies on people of character and of merit, so that the entire operation doesn't fall apart. And I think in instances like that, where they're so willing to drop everything that they have to rush up the hill and defend their neighbor, is a really good point of community, and it's something that obviously we're not all threatened with bounty hunters knocking at our door in the middle of the day or in the middle of the night. But I do think that is an important aspect to highlight, because it is where a lot of this activism does begin.
That's awesome. In your book, you call Reverend Rankin the ever practical radical. And that seems a little bit contradictory, but can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that, and where it helped and maybe where it hurt in his movement?
Yeah, so it's very intuitive to us today to be against slavery. It seems pretty self-evident at this point. In his day, it very much was not, and the specific kind of abolition that he was advancing, immediate emancipation. He wrote that if the slave has a right to freedom, then he has it now. So not in 10 or 20 years or in a generation, the way that several gradual emancipationists would have argued, because there was concern about, well, if you emancipate slaves immediately, then will that shock the system? Will there be a servile war between the races? And Rankin found that kind of misses the point and misses the idea of, well, slavery is at the root of the violence that you're so threatened by and so scared of. So the obvious solution is to end the system itself. Now that's not to say, the reason I call him practical is because when you look at someone who may be a little bit less practical, like a William Lloyd Garrison type figure, who is burning copies of the Constitution on the 4th of July and calling it a covenant with death and a compact with hell, that's not the territory that Rankin would have gone into, because he did revere the Union, and he did revere the people that make up this country in the South and in the North. He is a Southerner himself, so he obviously loves his community from where he was from, and whenever he's leaving Tennessee, it's a very particularly emotional section of the book that I closed the first chapter in, where he's leaving his father, particularly realizing that he may well never see him again, because even just a short travel, what is today short travel from Tennessee to Ohio, was the difference of life and death, essentially. Especially because his parents had recently already lost a child during the War of 1812. So the gravity of the situation of what Rankin was willing to do was very heavy. But he also understood that there are things where if you do try to make the great the enemy of the good, or the perfect the enemy of the great, then you're defeating your own cause. And he understood that, and he wanted to avoid that at all costs. So he would make compromises where he could, but the compromises would always benefit his position of immediate emancipation.
Awesome. Just pull up my notes here. I should have brought my glasses. We talk about one of the great things that AF does, and you all should apply to it once the application is open in the spring for our leadership fellowship. But one of the things that we talk about a lot in LEAD is principled leadership. What do you think we can learn about being a principled and ethical leader from Reverend Rankin?
Yeah. There's a lot of different examples that I could potentially, pull from. I think that his willingness to be on the front lines, so to speak, and his willingness to, I think it's very telling for who he was and his character that he only really left the South as far as he needed to. He only went to Ripley, Ohio. He could have gone further up to the Western Reserve in Ohio. He could have gone even further up than that to New England. But he sort of understood that this is where it matters most, at these crossroads here. So that example of servant leadership is, I think, a very powerful one. And it's one that kind of demonstrates he's not afraid to put his money where his mouth is, and he's not afraid to walk the walk, so to speak. And that itself did translate in having a stronger community in Ripley, because if it weren't for his leadership on that front, I don't think that the Ripley line would have been anywhere near as secure or as powerful as what it was.
That's awesome. Talk to me a little bit about what it's like to write a book. I think a lot of folks have, a passion project that they want to research, that it's like, okay, a book would be great at some point, maybe start smaller with a blog post, but you went and did the thing, right? So talk to me a little bit. Tell us more about, okay, what's the process like? How do you go about getting published? What does the research look like for this type of topic? And maybe any advice for aspiring authors that are after.
I think the first thing to keep in mind is that you want to write what hasn't already been written, which was a bit of a learning curve for me. I've always wanted to write history, and there are so many great stories in America in particular that just serves to inspire or serves to kind of paint a picture of what America is in reality and what it could be. But kind of realizing, because Reverend Rankin died in the town that I grew up in, realizing that he is this hero that has been virtually silent for most of American history since he died. There was an opportunity there, and everyone has written a book on Abraham Lincoln or or the founding fathers, or something along those lines. And there is value in those books, but there's so much more to American history that I think is largely untouched. And identifying those stories in your own communities. Now, maybe you don't want to write history, but that personal edge, or that local knowledge or local anecdotes that you can lean into is critical when you're writing a book. And I will also say that it's important to give yourself enough time, so you're not stressed or too crammed. It is a process, and you kind of have to let it flow and let it breathe. Also, find a regiment that works. I wrote mostly on weekends. As it got closer to the end, I started writing on weeknights, so I can get through with it. But sticking to that regiment and knowing that between 10 to 4 on Saturdays, that's my writing time. For other people I've spoken with, like, they do early mornings. So I have one friend who told me he would write his book, I think between like 4 and 8 every morning, because he has, a kid and a family and work life and stuff that he has to juggle around. So it doesn't really matter how you go about it. Some people, it's after work, when they get kind of their second wind. Whatever it is that you decide for it, just stick to it, because that rhythm will, it may feel slow at first, but eventually, you'll have a book in a handful of months, depending on how long it is. But also, again, giving yourself time is really important. That's probably the one thing that I wish I did more with this book, was to just kind of let it breathe and let the story kind of tell itself. Which I think that it largely did that, but there's always new information that's coming up. That's always good to put into it. And also know your story, know the confines of your story. If there's something that's completely unrelated to it, but you think it might be good to put in there, then know what's going to be good context versus just going down a rabbit hole, because it's super easy to go down a rabbit hole with something like this. But yeah, I think those are my top advices.
Awesome.
For people.
Book, Beatty, family life. What's next? What's the next book after this one? Because you can't just write one, right?
No, I can't.
What's the next thought or project or anything you can share about future works?
So I am working on a proposal right now for another story that does focus, again, kind of on the same time period, same theme, same region, because there are so many people during this time period. Especially, I should mention, when people think of the abolitionists, they think largely of what was going on in New England. But what happened in Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley is equally as important, and far less represented in American history. So I'm drawn to that, and I think that there's a lot of really rich characters throughout that region that very few people have touched. And yeah, that's all I'll say right now.
Yeah.
For that.
Keep our cards close.
Right.
I love it. That'd be awesome. We'll go ahead and open it up. Does anybody have any questions for Kilo? I see Tom.
Sure. Oh, thank you. This is an interesting story about somebody, to be honest, I wasn't familiar with at all. You mentioned he influenced people like William Lloyd Garrison. Was there a tipping point for Reverend Rankin that, something that happened either in his life or something he heard about that said, okay, we need immediate abolition? Because sometimes, quite often, folks who support this often have like sort of tipping point moment.
So to the best of our understanding, and there's documentation that supports this. He supported it pretty much from the beginning, which when the impact of his legacy was kind of being debated later in his life, and his son would go on and kind of write this pamphlet that would defend his legacy. He would write that Reverend Rankin was talking about these ideas since 1817, 1818, basically when he was starting to preach. And there's very strong indication as I go into the book that his mother had a profound influence on his anti-slavery thoughts. And there's strong indication that ever since he really considered the idea of slavery itself, he was against it.
What were his thoughts on colonization? Because around 1820, 1881 was when the whole colonization movement happened. So, what is his thought?
Yeah, that's a major point of contrast in the story, and he was very against it. And in fact, when in Lane Seminary in around Cincinnati, Ohio, there was a big controversy because Theodore Weld wanted to have a debate series, essentially, of the merits of colonization versus immediate abolition. And the faculty came down hard on them and said, you can't do this because it's going to incite a riot. And he had friends on the faculty, Reverend Rankin did, but he wrote a pamphlet that was not just in favor of the students at Lane Seminary, but also a scathing, rebuttal of colonization. And for context, the colonization was the theory that, or the proposal, I should say, that once you have emancipated slaves throughout the country, then you would essentially send them to a place where they may feel more at home, like Liberia or the West Indies. And this was very controversial because by the time that it really kind of came to its own, there were a lot of people who were being emancipated who were saying, I had no connection to Africa because I've been living, my family has been living here for generations now, under slavery. So sending me back here would do really nothing for me. I want to be an American. I want to be a citizen with equal rights. So there was, I think that some people approached it with a little bit more, with a little bit better intentions than others did. Obviously, there were those who just simply did not want to coexist with the black race. But others were, as I mentioned, concerned about the compatibility between blacks and whites. And to Rankin, that ultimately was more of a condemnation of the state of slavery rather than the state of whether or not blacks and whites could coexist.
What strategies made him so successful at organizing people around an idea that at the time was really unpopular?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, following up with the prior question, the reason why colonization was becoming popular around 1816 to 1820, around that time, political abolition had been kind of deemed a failure. There were the founders and many people in that generation had tried to either prevent the expansion of slavery into the West or outright abolish it. And a lot of those plans had fallen through, especially in the South. So colonization started to pop up as this alternative idea to that. When the abolitionists kind of were licking their wounds and said, we've kind of lost sight on what it is that we're trying to affect here, they realized that politics was not the answer. That first and foremost, it had to be through moral suasion. that if you're trying to affect change through the whole of the people have to understand the moral depravity of this and not just kind of like turn a blind eye because it's ugly to look at and then carry on with their life. So he really leaned into, and he wasn't the first one to really lean into moral suasion, but he did it so effectively because of the nature of his letters, because his letters on American slavery, because there was a family drama at the in the background of it, because his brother Thomas had written to him in 1823, letting him know that he had participated in the slave trade, and he had purchased slaves. So he waited several months, I think about 8 months, before he eventually was founded, and he wrote a public letter campaign, is what it essentially was. Instead of sending his letters to his brother directly, he put them in the local paper, whose editor was renting from him in the same apartment at the time. And it was also cheaper to send him the newspaper rather than go through postage. So he kind of killing two birds with one stone. He was responding to his brother and then also getting these ideas out there into a broader audience for more people to hear. And once they were out there, then they were out there. You know, people were able to hear it. So I think that making sure that the truth was available was the first step in his strategy. And of course, the American Anti-Slavery Society, once Garrison got his hands on them, he reprinted all the letters through the Liberator for a more national audience. The Anti-Slavery Society used these as a textbook for newcomers and just kind of spread like wildfire from there. So that the moral authority in that and making sure that they had kind of all their ducks in a row was really the first step in that strategy.
So the follow-up, he mailed us a lot of letters. In those letters, did he highlight the potential repercussions of colonization versus abolition? And like right now, we have the power of hindsight. So in hindsight, if he did write about it, did any of those come true? Or was it a completely different perspective that he had?
He did touch on colonization, not as much as he did in the pamphlet that I mentioned after the Lane debates. But essentially every argument that he could consider was touched on. Everything from the love of gain, bringing people to want to engage in slavery in the first place, to the biblical position on slavery, to the state of slavery in states like Kentucky, where it was kind of viewed as benevolent compared to those in the Deep South. Everything that he could consider were rebuked through these letters from Rankin. Yeah.
Question, two-part question, actually. Firstly, what inspired you to write about this gentleman? A lot of times, editors will admire like historical figures. Maybe there's familial ties. You mentioned earlier that you shared the same hometown as this gentleman. Was that something that inspired you to write about him? And the second part is that bridge connecting you from just knowing about this gentleman and learning about the gentleman to wanting to write about him. What was that first step like for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, he lived most of his life throughout Ripley, but then toward his twilight years, especially after his wife died in 1878, he moved to a town called Ironton, Ohio, and fast forward about 150 years, that's where I'm growing up. And the museum where the Lawrence County Historical Society is currently located is the house that he died in at that time. So I had kind of known of Rankin loosely since I was about 14, like maybe 13. But outside of just knowing that he had an influence on our town growing up, because a lot of the original founders of Ironton, Ohio were from Ripley and the surrounding area. outside of that, and knowing he was an abolitionist from Ripley, Ohio, there wasn't too much that I knew about him until I really started digging into this concept for my first book, which was the story of the abolitionists along the Ohio River Valley. And I remember Rankin, and I thought that he would make a really good figure, and I kind of looked more into him and realized the impacts that he made. And I realized that not only is he this monumental figure, he's also perhaps like one of the most important Americans to live, and that excited me because I had this figure right in my backyard that most people overlook or have never heard of. That was ripe for telling. So I sent the idea of the original idea into my publisher, and they kind of agreed that Rankin was the figure that needed to be told about. So they suggested that I take on his biography, and I did, and I'm really happy I did.
Anybody else?
Oh, this isn't too dumb a question. Did he have any relation to Jeanette Rankin?
Jeanette?
She was a suffragette, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Like like early 1900s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I was somewhat familiar with her.
In Montana, right?
Possibly.
Okay. Yeah. If I'm thinking of the same person, because I know there was a relation there. Okay. But yeah.
Solid family.
Yeah. You know, his family actually is incredibly rich, and not rich literally, but in their heritage, his father and uncle were at the surrender of Cornwallis during the Battle of Yorktown. His ancestors go back to the Battle of Londonderry in Ireland, where they were fighting against King James, and you have this rich lineage of basically constantly fighting for freedom, whether it be religious liberty, whether it be anti-slavery, throughout at least as far back as the 1600s.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That might be your third book then. Okay, which family member do you want to talk about? All right, here we go. So, any other questions for Caleb from the audience? So, you talked about what's next. How can we best support you and your writing endeavors? Obviously, everyone's going home with a book, but where can we find you on the internet?
Yeah. Well, you can just follow me on Twitter or X at Caleb Franz. I'm mostly posting about my work right now. I don't really tweet like I used to, which I think is good for people to do. But I'm mostly kind of focusing on my work and focusing on these stories. So I am continuing to write these stories. So if this interests you, or if any of Rankin's life interests you, then please consider just keeping tabs on that. And yeah, and tell friends and tell your family about the book, because this becomes more well-known whenever more people are kind of bought into the story. And I think that Rankin has a particularly good story to buy into. So just share it with your friends and family, and have them order a copy if they're interested.
Awesome. Well, Caleb, thank you on behalf of America's Future, but of course on behalf of Casey and myself. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making the drive. I didn't tell you this, but we got you a little something since it's your anniversary. Wow. I could not let you go home without, drumroll please, Albanese gummies here in the car. So thank you. So you're much. Folks, Caleb has offered to go ahead and sign up your book for you, so please